Today it's a wet day at home, not an awful lot to do, so I thought I'd tell you another story, this time about grandparents and parents and the value of them, how valuable grandparents are. If you're a grandparent, or if you have grandparents, or if you're intending to have grandparents or children, grandchildren, then it might be a valuable lesson to listen to this. Maybe not quite so much for parents. But before I tell you a little story, please, if you like what you hear, subscribe so that you can enjoy more stories. Press like if you like it, and there's a little bell on your buzzer there that if you press that, you'll also get notifications of any stories that I post in the future. I had a bit of a mixed upbringing when I was very young, but a couple of things that my grandparents said to me have held me in good stead all my life. My grandmother and Arthur, he wasn't actually my grandfather. My grandmother had been married 3 times, but Arthur was, I think she finally realized that if you don't marry them, they might last. So she was living with Arthur at the time. Arthur was a big, broad Yorkshireman with a big moustache who used to love to tell stories. And especially after he'd had a few sherries before dinner, he'd get out the sherries, tipple with the sherries, and we'd sit outside sometimes and he'd tell me various stories. But the more sherries he had, the more his accent became broader, until it got to the stage that he was telling me these stories in Yorkshire accent that I had no idea what he was talking about. But it was very enjoyable to listen to. Anyway, my grandmother and Arthur had a poultry farm and a strawberry farm. They had 2 great little dogs. One of them wasn't so little. He was a great big Alsatian dog called Rex, and a little terrier that they used to call Boy. When they went through every evening, Arthur used to go through the poultry pens with pens, not the quarter poultry sheds, and looking for the rats that had come and steal all the eggs, because the hens were all caged up. And Rex would run through the pens, barking, scaring the rats out. Arthur had this little 22 pellet rifle, and he'd shoot the rabbits off the beams, and the little terrier Boy would run around the pens, pick them up, shake them until he broke their back, and take them outside and pile them all up in a big pile outside, which Arthur would then take away and bury. Used to be a wonderful place to go picking the strawberries. My grandmother would say, "Would you mind helping me pick the strawberries?" She used to sell them from the front fence, over the front fence of her yard. But of course, for every one you picked, you ate about 4 or 5, until you got sick of them, of course. And very hard to get sick of strawberries, though. They are delicious. Great big red ripe strawberries. Eventually, they got too old to manage that, and they moved to a house north of Auckland in New Zealand. I was very young at this stage, about 14, 15. It was a lovely little place. Grandma used to sit in the kitchen. She loved to cook, and she'd be in the kitchen looking through the windows over these beautiful green fields, cows and sheep in the distance. Just the most idyllic place. It wasn't a farm. She didn't have a farm. They just had a little housing lot, but it was in the midst of farmland, and their closest neighbour was about 5 or 6 blocks away. And it was really a wonderful life for them in retirement, because they had to manage their money very carefully. Many people, when they get to retirement, even if they've been working for themselves, or possibly especially if they've been working for themselves for many years, have nothing except the house that they're living in, if they're lucky, maybe a little nest egg, and some pension, if they're lucky enough to be living in a country which provides you with a pension, a government pension. And that's what my grandparents were like. They said to me once, my grandmother said, we've got a little bit of a nest egg put aside, but once that's gone, we have nothing left in the world except this house. Never registered to me for years later, not many great pieces of knowledge or intuition register with kids at 14 or 15 until some years later when you think about it and you think, what am I going to do when I get to retirement? Do I really want to be in the same position as that? I was living in New Zealand at the time, which was a long way from anywhere else in the world. This was back in the 1950s, early 1960s, when the world was really a magical place. Elvis Presley and the Beatles were making sound waves all around the world. Man was landing on the moon. Woodstock was happening. And it felt like the world was really passing you by. Being stuck in a little island in the middle of the South Pacific. But it was really a lovely place to live, especially when Arthur would take you through his orchids. He had a big greenhouse. We used to grow orchids. And loved his orchids. He'd sit in the backyards when he was having a sherry. And one day he said to me, Jeff, just listen. I cocked my ears. Couldn't hear anything at all. Nothing at all. And I said, I don't hear anything. He said, just listen. Listen. I listened again. And I said, I don't hear anything at all. I said, a couple of cows mooing in the distance, and that's about it. Nothing. I can't hear anything. And he said, yeah, isn't it wonderful? Wonderful just to sit in complete silence that people in the city very rarely ever experience. The cars going past, trucks, planes, well, maybe not so many planes these days, trains, whatever, people shouting, neighbors calling out. Complete silence is a magical thing. You may be even able to hear right now a neighbor in the background hammering. He used to go down and he used to have this wonderful, massive, great lemon tree in the backyard. And when he'd had too many sherries, he'd go down and pee under the lemon tree and say, just adds a bit of flavor to the urea. He loved it. He loved it. He loved life, even though life to him was very, very simple. And all I wanted to do was to get out of the country, to just go and see the world and experience life. Grandmother was a very good cook. She used to love to bake these wonderful roast dinners, especially roast beef. And Arthur used to come and he insisted. He was the only one who could make the Yorkshire pudding. So he used to mix up the flour and the eggs and the milk just as how he liked it, put it in a big tray, and well, he used to put the oil in the pan, get it very, very hot before he poured it in, put it in the oven. The temperature had to be just perfect. And I got to admit, his Yorkshire pudding, when you poured the gravy over the top of it, was wonderful. But so were Grandma's cakes. And I was in her kitchen one time, and she was baking a cake. And she poured it into the cake pan, and she'd put it in the oven. And I had my finger out, and I was licking the bowl, as kids do, trying to savor all the flavors. And she was trying to teach me about life, as grandparents tend to do. Parents tend to tell you what you can't do. Grandparents tend to tell you what you can do. Right? They tend to open up life for you. So never underestimate the effect that if you are a grandparent that you can have on your children. And the thing that she told me, which I'll share with you in just a moment, has lived with me all my life. I'm a grandparent now myself. not a very good one, but I am a grandparent. 4 children. My daughter has 4 children. I have 2 children. And grandparents are wonderful. This is the first piece of advice that she will give you. I'll tell you more about others in the future. So I was licking the bowl, saving the flavors, and she said to me, anything anybody else can do, and I interrupted and I said, yeah, I know. Anything anyone else can do, I can do better. And I carried on licking the bowl, paying little attention, until I suddenly realized that she'd stopped talking. She wasn't saying anything. And I looked up, and she was standing there looking at me, right? Saying nothing, looking down her nose at me. Now, grandmother was a very tiny woman. She was only about 5 foot tall. Lovely grey hair, as all grandmothers do. Sometimes they're blue, but you know what I mean. When she was younger, she used to be on the stage in London as a chorus girl, and she worked with some of the top names, but that was, by golly, that was gone long time ago. And I dare say that she was actually quite enjoyed herself a lot when she was on the stage, because she never used to talk about it a lot. But when she did, she always had this twinkle in her eye. You know. My father asked her one time, because many people used to take him for being Spanish. And he asked her one time, was there any Spanish blood in our background? And she would never answer directly, until one day she whispered to me quietly. She said, there was actually an indiscretion in the family some years ago. But that's as much as she would say. As much as she would say. So she was standing there looking at me. And I said, what? It's nothing special. Anything anybody else can do, I can do better. It's just a saying, you know, it's quite common. Everybody knows it. And she said, what makes you so arrogant? What do you mean? He said, what makes you so arrogant to think that you can do things better than the greatest men in the world, greatest men and women in the world? She said, understand what this means. She said, anything anybody else can do, you can do, because all you have to do is follow in their footsteps. Once they have led the way, you can follow them. And if you follow them closely enough, you will probably be as successful as they have been. I use, for example, Roger Bannister as an example. Roger Bannister was the first man ever to run the 4-minute mile. And many people have tried to do it before him. And nobody had succeeded, till one day he got together with a friend of his, another athlete. I can't remember what his name is off the top of my head, but this man wasn't a mile runner. He was a speedster. He used to run the 2:20 and the 4:40, a quarter mile and a half mile. And he sent him out fast to pace him. And Roger Bannister just got him behind, loped behind, followed in his footsteps, just carried on. And after about 800 meters or thereabouts, his friend just dropped out of the race. And Roger Bannister carried on and broke the 4-minute mile. After he'd done it, other people did it many times. Within months, it had been broken about another 4 or 5 times. And this was a time that most people believed was impossible to do. Now it's been broken. If you don't run the mile under 4 minutes, you're not even in the race these days. So grandmother said to me, what makes you so arrogant at the age of 15 to think that you can do things better than the greatest minds and the greatest people in the world? If, to use my analogy, you just follow in the footsteps of Roger Bannister, you can do anything and achieve anything you want to. All you have to do is copy what they did. Later on, I got to thinking about this, and it made a hell of a lot of sense. When I went into business some years later, and I studied successful people, I found that this was actually quite a common sort of thing. Just pick a mentor and follow what your mentor did, and you can become successful. But at the age of 14 or 15, it didn't resonate with me immediately, but it stuck in my mind. It stuck in my mind, as my grandma has, for the little pearls of wisdom that she has given me over the years. Right? I'll tell you more about them another time, but I want to finish up by saying that if you're a grandparent, do not underestimate the impact that you can have on young minds. At the time my grandmother told me this, she probably thought, oh, what's the point of wasting my time on this silly young fella? Later on when she died, and I came to realize what she was talking about. Unfortunately, she will never really excuse me. She will never really know the impact that she had on my life for that and other things that she did. So please, love your children, but love your grandchildren too. Thanks for listening. Please, if you like the story, subscribe, listen to some more in the future. Press like if you liked, and ring the bell. That way you'll get a reminder of when I post something else. Thank you very much.